The next evening arrived with the weight of expectation hanging in the air. Sarah had spent her entire shift at the diner replaying the previous night's study session, amazed at how clearly she could recall the concepts Jake had explained. When Mrs. Henderson, a regular customer, complained about her blood pressure medication, Sarah found herself actually understanding the conversation instead of nodding blankly. Emma was already in her pajamas when Jake knocked at exactly 9 o'clock, carrying 2 cups of coffee and what appeared to be a small leather journal tucked under his arm. Sarah had spent an embarrassing amount of time changing clothes and fixing her hair, telling herself it was just because she wanted to look professional for studying. "Good evening, ladies," Jake said, tipping his hat to both Sarah and Emma, who giggled at the formal greeting. "Ready for another adventure in medical mysteries?" Emma clapped her hands excitedly. "Can I help study too? I know some body parts. I know where my heart is." She pressed her small hand dramatically against her chest. Jake crouched down to Emma's level, his expression serious. "That's very impressive, Miss Emma. The heart is one of the most important parts to understand. Maybe you can be our assistant tonight." Sarah watched this interaction with growing warmth. It had been just the two of them for so long that seeing someone treat Emma with such genuine respect felt almost overwhelming. Her ex-husband had never shown interest in their daughter beyond complaining about the noise she made. "Actually," Jake continued, pulling out his leather journal, "I brought something special tonight. These are sketches I made when I was learning about animal anatomy on the ranch. I thought they might help us understand how bodies work." Sarah leaned over to look as he opened the journal, gasping at what she saw. The pages were filled with detailed, beautifully drawn diagrams of horses, cattle, and other farm animals, but annotated with notes about muscles, organs, and skeletal structures. The artwork was professional quality, each line precise and purposeful. "Jake, these are incredible," she breathed, running her finger along the edge of a particularly detailed drawing of a horse's respiratory system. "You drew all of these?" A slight flush colored his cheeks. "It was the only way I could learn back then. My grandfather always said if you can't draw something, you don't really understand it. Spent most of my teenage years sketching every animal on the ranch from the inside out." "Were you planning to be a veterinarian?" Sarah asked, studying the meticulous attention to detail in his drawings. Jake's expression grew distant for a moment. "Something like that. Life had other plans." He seemed to shake himself back to the present. "But that's not important right now. What matters is your exam next week. What specific areas are you most worried about?" Sarah sensed there was more to his story, but she respected his obvious desire to change the subject. She pulled out her study guide, pointing to the sections marked with multiple question marks and frustrated scribbles. "The endocrine system is completely baffling to me. I understand that hormones are chemical messengers, but I can't keep track of which glands produce what or how they all interact." Jake studied her notes for a moment, then flipped to a fresh page in his journal. "Let me show you something that might help." His pencil began moving across the paper with confident strokes, and Sarah watched in fascination as the drawing took shape. "Think of the endocrine system as the ranch's communication network," he said as he drew. "Before cell phones and radios, ranchers had to use other methods to coordinate work across vast distances. They used signal fires, horn calls, and messenger riders." He sketched a network of connected outposts across a landscape, each with its own signal fire. "The hypothalamus is like the main ranch house where all the decisions are made. When something needs to happen, say preparing for winter, it sends out signals to different outposts." Sarah found herself drawn into the analogy immediately. So each outpost would be a different gland. Exactly. The pituitary gland is like the foreman who takes orders from the ranch house and passes them on to the specific work crews. Jake's pencil continued moving, adding details to his sketch. When the ranch house decides it's time to prepare for breeding season, it tells the foreman, who then sends specific messages to the crews responsible for that work. Emma, who had been quietly coloring at the other end of the table, piped up suddenly, like when Mama tells me to clean my room, and then I tell my toys to get in the toy box. Jake's face lit up with delight. That's a perfect example, Emma. You're exactly right. The toys are like the target organs that receive the hormone messages. Sarah felt that familiar click of understanding as the complex web of hormone interactions began to make sense through Jake's ranch analogy. She started asking questions, and Jake patiently answered each one while continuing to sketch illustrative diagrams. As they worked through different hormones and their functions, Sarah became aware of other things about her mysterious neighbor. His hands moved with the practiced confidence of someone who had spent years drawing. When he concentrated, a small crease appeared between his eyebrows, and he had a habit of absently tapping his pencil against his lip when thinking through complex explanations. More than that, she noticed how he seemed to anticipate her areas of confusion before she even voiced them. When she struggled with the concept of negative feedback loops, he was already sketching an example before she asked. When she looked puzzled about hormone transport, he launched into an explanation about how the ranch's messenger system would adapt to different types of emergencies. "You're an incredible teacher," Sarah said during a brief break, watching him refine a diagram of the thyroid gland. "Have you ever considered doing this professionally?" Jake's pencil stilled, and something flickered across his expression, too quickly for Sarah to interpret. "Teaching isn't really in the cards for me," he said quietly, "but I'm glad I can help you." There was something in his tone that suggested a story behind those words. But before Sarah could probe further, Emma's sleepy voice interrupted from where she had curled up on the couch. "Mama, is the nice cowboy going to help you pass your test?" Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment at her daughter's directness, but Jake simply smiled. "I think your mama is going to do just fine on her test. She's learning faster than anyone I've ever worked with." "Good," Emma mumbled, her eyes already closing, "because Mama cries sometimes when she thinks I'm asleep. But she hasn't cried since you started helping." The innocent observation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had thought she was hiding her stress and overwhelm from Emma, but apparently her 7-year-old was more perceptive than she had realized. Sarah felt tears threaten at the edges of her vision, partly from embarrassment and partly from the realization of how much her struggles had been affecting her daughter. Jake's expression grew gentle. Sometimes grown-ups need help figuring things out, just like kids do. There's nothing wrong with that. Emma nodded solemnly from the couch. "That's what I told Mama. I said maybe God would send someone to help her with the hard books." An awkward silence settled over the room. Sarah wasn't particularly religious, and she had no idea about Jake's beliefs, but Emma's matter-of-fact faith in divine intervention felt both touching and uncomfortable. "Well," Jake said carefully, "sometimes help comes from unexpected places. The important thing is that your mama is working very hard to build a better life for both of you." They continued studying until well past midnight, working through pancreatic functions and adrenal responses until Sarah felt confident she could explain the major hormone pathways. Jake's teaching method was unlike anything she had experienced in traditional classrooms. He never made her feel stupid for asking the same question multiple times, and he seemed to instinctively know when to push her understanding further and when to let a concept settle. As he prepared to leave, Jake tore several pages from his journal, the detailed hormone system diagrams he had drawn throughout the evening. "Keep these," he said, pressing them into her hands. "Sometimes it helps to have visual references when you're taking the actual exam." Sarah looked down at the intricate drawings, knowing she was holding hours of careful work. "Jake, I can't take these. You spent so much time on them. They're more useful to you than they are to me sitting in that journal," he replied firmly. Besides, teaching you helped me remember why I loved learning about how bodies work in the first place. There was something wistful in his voice that made Sarah look up sharply, but his expression had already shuttered closed. She wanted to ask about his background, about why someone with his obvious knowledge and teaching ability was living in their rundown apartment complex, working odd jobs. But the walls he had carefully constructed around certain topics were clearly visible, and she respected them. "Will you come tomorrow night, too?" she asked instead, hating how hopeful her voice sounded. "I mean, if you don't have other plans. I still have the respiratory system to review, and pharmacology calculations that are making me want to cry." Jake's smile was answer enough. "Wouldn't miss it. Though I should warn you, math was never my strongest subject." "That's okay," Sarah said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Maybe I can teach you something for once." After he left, Sarah sat studying the beautiful diagrams he had drawn, each line and label clearly marked in his neat handwriting. She found herself wondering about the man behind the cowboy hat, about the story that had brought him to her hallway at exactly the moment she needed help most. Emma had already fallen asleep on the couch, and Sarah gently carried her to bed, tucking the blankets around her small form. As she did, her daughter's words echoed in her mind. Maybe God would send someone to help her with the hard books. Sarah wasn't sure about divine intervention, but she couldn't deny that Jake's arrival in her life felt like exactly the kind of miracle she had been too proud to pray for. As she settled down to review the hormone diagrams one more time before bed, she realized that for the first time since starting nursing school, she was actually looking forward to studying. More than that, she was looking forward to tomorrow night, to Jake's patient explanations and encouraging smile, to the way he made her feel capable and intelligent instead of overwhelmed and inadequate. She was looking forward to seeing him again, and that realization both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. Sarah Martinez stared at the textbook spread across her kitchen table, the words swimming before her tired eyes. The single light bulb hanging above cast harsh shadows across the pages of her nursing exam preparation materials. At 28, she felt ancient compared to her younger classmates who seemed to absorb information like sponges. Her calloused hands, roughened from years of waitressing and cleaning jobs, trembled slightly as she turned another page. The small apartment felt suffocating in the summer heat. Her ancient air conditioning unit wheezed in the corner, barely managing to cool the cramped space she shared with her 7-year-old daughter, Emma. Medical terminology felt like a foreign language, and despite studying for hours each night after her double shifts at the diner, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was drowning. A gentle knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw Jake Thompson, her neighbor from across the hall. He stood there holding a cup of coffee, his weathered cowboy hat pushed back on his head. Jake was an enigma in their rundown apartment complex. He dressed like he belonged on a ranch, complete with worn leather boots and faded jeans, yet he lived in the heart of the city. Sarah hesitated before opening the door. She barely knew Jake beyond polite hallway exchanges, though Emma had mentioned the kind cowboy who always smiled at her when they passed in the corridor. Tonight, Sarah's pride warred with her exhaustion. She looked terrible, wearing an old t-shirt with coffee stains, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. "Evening, Sarah," Jake said softly, tipping his hat slightly. His voice carried a gentle Texas drawl that seemed out of place in their urban setting. "I hope you don't mind me bothering you this late. I noticed your light's been on past midnight every night this week. Thought you might need some caffeine." Sarah's defenses crumbled at his genuine concern. She accepted the steaming cup gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. "That's very kind of you, Jake. I'm just studying." She gestured helplessly toward her cluttered table. "Trying to anyway." "Nursing school?" he asked, glancing at the medical books visible through the doorway. Sarah nodded, surprised he knew. "Yeah, It's harder than I expected. Actually, everything about it is harder than I expected. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. The classes, the studying, balancing it all with work, and Emma. Some days, I wonder if I'm fooling myself thinking I can actually do this. Jake's expression grew thoughtful. Mind if I ask what's giving you the most trouble? Sarah found herself opening the door wider. Something about his calm presence, putting her at ease. Everything, really. But anatomy and physiology are killing me. I can memorize the terms, but I can't seem to understand how it all connects. My instructor says I need to think more systematically, but I don't even know what that means. I might be able to help with that, Jake said quietly. Sarah looked at him skeptically. No offense, but you're a cowboy. What would you know about medical stuff? A small smile played at the corners of Jake's mouth. You'd be surprised what a cowboy picks up along the way. I've had to patch up plenty of injured animals over the years. Learning anatomy was part of survival on the ranch where I grew up. Something in his tone made Sarah reconsider. She was desperate enough to accept help from anyone at this point. I don't want to impose. It's already late, and you probably have work tomorrow. I'm between jobs right now, Jake said simply. And I'm a night owl anyway. If you're willing, I'd be happy to take a look at what's giving you trouble. Sarah studied his face in the dim hallway light. There was something solid and reassuring about Jake Thompson, something that made her want to trust him despite barely knowing him. Perhaps it was the way he spoke to Emma with genuine kindness, or how he always held the elevator door for elderly Mrs. Chen from the second floor. Maybe it was simply that she was too exhausted to maintain her usual walls. Okay, she said finally, stepping aside to let him in. But I warn you, it's a mess in here, and I'm probably the worst student you'll ever encounter. Jake entered her small apartment, his presence somehow making the cramped space feel less claustrophobic. He hung his hat on the back of a chair and rolled up the sleeves of his flannel shirt, revealing forearms marked with old scars and rope burns. Sarah noticed his hands were gentle despite their obvious strength, the hands of someone accustomed to careful, precise work. Let's see what we're working with, he said, settling into the chair across from her. Sarah watched as his eyes scanned her notes and textbooks. His expression remained patient and encouraging, never once showing judgment about her obvious struggles. Tell me how you've been approaching this, Jake said, pointing to a diagram of the human circulatory system. Walk me through what you understand so far. Sarah began explaining her memorization techniques, how she tried to drill the names of blood vessels and organs until they stuck. As she talked, she noticed Jake listening intently, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. He never interrupted or made her feel stupid for her confusion. I see the problem, he said gently when she finished. You're trying to memorize everything as separate pieces instead of seeing the whole picture. The human body is like a ranch. Everything has to work together for the whole operation to function. Sarah frowned. I don't understand what you mean. Jake leaned forward, his expression earnest. Think of the heart as the ranch headquarters. It's got to pump blood. That's like the ranch hands out to every part of the property to get the work done. The arteries are like the main roads carrying supplies out to the far pastures, and the veins are the roads bringing the workers back home. As he continued the analogy, something clicked in Sarah's mind. For the first time, the circulatory system began to make sense not as a collection of random parts to memorize, but as an interconnected system with a clear purpose. She found herself leaning forward, engaged in a way she hadn't been in weeks of studying. That actually makes sense, she breathed, looking at the diagram with fresh eyes. So if the heart is weak, it's like having a poor headquarters that can't organize the work properly. Exactly, Jake smiled, his whole face lighting up with genuine pleasure at her understanding. And what do you think happens if one of the main roads, say a major artery, gets blocked? Sarah thought for a moment, applying the ranch metaphor. The workers can't get to that section of the ranch, so that area suffers while other parts have to work harder to compensate. Perfect, Jake said, and Sarah felt a warm glow of accomplishment she hadn't experienced in months. Now you're thinking like a nurse instead of just memorizing like a student. They continued working through the material, Jake patiently translating complex medical concepts into practical analogies that Sarah could grasp. He never made her feel rushed or stupid when she struggled with a concept. Instead, he simply found different ways to explain until something resonated. As the night wore on, Sarah found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't in months. The crushing weight of academic pressure seemed to lift slightly with each concept that finally made sense. More than that, she began to remember why she had wanted to become a nurse in the first place. Not just to escape poverty, but because she genuinely wanted to help people heal. When Emma wandered out of her bedroom around midnight, rubbing sleepy eyes, Jake greeted her with the same gentle kindness he'd shown Sarah. "Hey there, little miss. Did we wake you up?" Emma shook her head, climbing onto Sarah's lap with the unconscious trust of a child. "Mama's been sad about her books," she said matter-of-factly. "Are you helping her not be sad anymore?" Jake's expression grew soft as he looked at the little girl. "I'm trying to help your mama understand her books better. She's very smart, you know. She just needed someone to explain things in a different way." Emma beamed at this assessment of her mother's intelligence, and Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the simple validation. It had been so long since anyone had called her smart, since anyone had seen potential in her rather than just another struggling, single mother. After Emma returned to bed, Sarah and Jake continued their study session. She was amazed at how much material they had covered, how many previously confusing concepts now seemed manageable. More importantly, she felt a spark of confidence she hadn't experienced since starting the nursing program. "Jake," she said as he gathered his things to leave, "I can't thank you enough for this. You've done more to help me understand this material in one night than I've managed in weeks on my own." "You did all the hard work," he replied, settling his hat back on his head. "I just helped you see what was already there. You're a lot smarter than you give yourself credit for, Sarah." As he reached the door, Sarah found herself asking, "Would you? I mean, if you don't mind, could we do this again tomorrow night? I have an exam next week, and there's still so much I don't understand." Jake paused his hand on the doorknob and turned back to her with a smile that made her heart skip unexpectedly. "I'd be honored to help, Sarah. Same time tomorrow." After he left, Sarah sat staring at her now organized notes and the diagrams that finally made sense. For the first time in months, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she really could do this. She thought about Jake's patient explanations, his gentle encouragement, and the way he'd made her feel capable rather than stupid. As she prepared for bed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something important had shifted tonight. It wasn't just about understanding anatomy and physiology, though that breakthrough felt monumental. There was something about Jake Thompson, something about the way he'd appeared at exactly the moment she needed help most, that felt like more than mere coincidence. She fell asleep that night with medical terms dancing through her head, but for once they felt manageable rather than overwhelming. And somewhere in her dreams, a gentle Texas drawl was explaining the mysteries of the human body with the patience of someone who understood that learning was a journey, not a destination. The third night arrived with an unexpected thunderstorm that sent rain pelting against Sarah's windows and lightning illuminating her small apartment in brief, dramatic flashes. She had been pacing nervously for the past hour, her anatomy textbooks spread across every available surface in preparation for tomorrow's comprehensive exam. When Jake knocked at 9 o'clock sharp, he was soaking wet despite carrying a large umbrella. Sarah rushed to get him a towel, while Emma giggled at his bedraggled appearance, his usually neat hair now plastered to his head and his cowboy hat dripping water onto her kitchen floor. "Sorry about the mess," he said, accepting the towel gratefully. Mother Nature decided to test whether cowboys are waterproof tonight. Are they? Emma asked seriously, making both adults laugh. Definitely not, Jake replied, wringing water from his hat brim. Though we're pretty good at pretending we don't mind getting soaked. As Jake dried off, Sarah noticed something different about him tonight. There was a tension in his shoulders, a distraction in his eyes that hadn't been there before. When he settled at the table and pulled out his journal, she saw his hands trembling slightly, the whether from cold or something else. She couldn't tell. Big day tomorrow, he said, attempting his usual encouraging smile. How are you feeling about the exam? Terrified, but prepared, Sarah admitted. Thanks to you. I actually think I understand most of the material now, which feels like a miracle. They began reviewing respiratory system functions. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Jake's mind was elsewhere. His explanations were still clear and patient, but he kept glancing toward the window where lightning continued to flash across the dark sky. When a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the building, he actually flinched. Jake, are you okay? Sarah finally asked. You seem distracted tonight. He was quiet for a long moment, his pencil frozen over a half-finished diagram of lung anatomy. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual, almost hesitant. 3 years ago today, I was supposed to start my first semester of veterinary school, he said without looking up. Had everything planned out. Full scholarship, apartment near campus, the whole dream laid out in front of me. Sarah felt her breath catch. This was the first real personal information Jake had shared about himself, and she could hear the pain underlying his careful words. What happened? She asked gently. Jake set down his pencil and finally met her eyes. My younger sister Maria was driving to my going-away party. It was storming, just like tonight. Another driver ran a red light, and he swallowed hard. She was in the hospital for 8 months. Multiple surgeries, learning to walk again, the works. Sarah's heart clenched at the raw grief in his voice. Oh, Jake, I'm so sorry. The scholarship had a deferral option, but only for 1 year. I used it to help take care of Maria, thinking she'd recover faster than she did. He managed a bitter smile. Turns out the human body doesn't heal on convenient timelines. Emma, who had been quietly coloring, looked up with the intuitive concern children often display. Is your sister okay now? Jake's expression softened as he looked at the little girl. She's doing much better, sweetheart. She can walk and run and do most everything she used to do. But it took a long time, and by then my scholarship was gone. Couldn't you reapply? Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Vet school is expensive, and I'd already used up my savings helping with Maria's medical bills. Plus, my grades from the year I took off weren't exactly stellar. Hard to focus on studying when you're spending every day in hospital waiting rooms. The pieces of Jake's story were falling into place in Sarah's mind. His knowledge of anatomy, his teaching ability, the careful way he approached each explanation as if it mattered deeply to him. You gave up your dream to help your family. I didn't give it up, Jake corrected quietly. I just had to postpone it indefinitely. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one most days. Sarah stared at him, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. This man who had appeared in her hallway like an answer to prayer wasn't just a kind neighbor with random medical knowledge. He was someone who understood exactly what it felt like to have dreams deferred by circumstances beyond control. Is that why you're helping me? She asked. Because you recognize something familiar in my situation. Jake was quiet for a moment, considering her question. Maybe partly, but mostly I'm helping because you remind me why I wanted to study medicine in the first place. Watching you learn, seeing that moment when complex concepts finally click. It reminds me that knowledge is meant to be shared, not hoarded. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, and Sarah saw something shift in Jake's expression. a decision being made, walls being carefully lowered. "There's something else," he said slowly. "I've been accepted to the state university's pre-veterinary program for spring semester. It's not the prestigious school I originally planned on, and I'll have to work twice as hard to prove myself, but it's a chance to get back on track." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. Joy for his opportunity, but also a selfish sadness at the thought of losing him. "Jake, that's wonderful. You'll be an amazing veterinarian." "The thing is," he continued, not quite meeting her eyes, "the program starts in January, 3 months from now." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Sarah felt something inside her chest constrict at the thought of Jake leaving, of going back to struggling through her studies alone. But more than that, she realized with startling clarity that she would miss him for reasons that had nothing to do with academics. Over the past 3 nights, Jake had become more than just a tutor. He had become the bright spot in her overwhelming days, the person who made her feel capable and valued. She had begun to look forward to their evening sessions, not just for the learning, but for his gentle humor, his patient kindness, and the way he looked at her like she was someone worth investing in. "That's incredible, Jake," she said, forcing enthusiasm into her voice. "When did you find out?" "The acceptance letter came yesterday. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you." He finally met her eyes, and Sarah saw her own conflicted emotions reflected there. "I don't want to leave you without support. These next few months are crucial for your program." Emma, who had been listening to their conversation with the serious attention children reserve for important adult discussions, suddenly spoke up. "But you can't leave yet. Mama still needs help with her books. And she's getting good at not crying." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment at her daughter's blunt observation. But Jake simply smiled at Emma with genuine affection. "Your mama is much stronger than she realizes," he said gently. "She was succeeding before I came along. I just helped her see what was already there." "But what if she gets scared again?" Emma persisted with the logic of a 7-year-old. "What if she forgets how to understand the hard words?" Sarah was about to redirect Emma when Jake held up a hand. "That's actually a very good point, Miss Emma.